Hi there. I'm assuming that you watched my Dunkin' Donuts story. So I got back to my teaching at Harvard the next day. I was sure that I had a really good offering. In fact, I used that tape year after year. Why? Well, as I told the students, they were waiting for me in the basement, 15 of them, I said, look, something happened on the road last night that was very instructive. It wasn't that it was a great event. I mean, it was just this guy, doing his Elvis impersonations. Nothing particularly special about that. But there was a terrific lesson for me on how the camera interacts with whatever it is we're shooting. As you saw in the tape there, I was reluctant in a way to go in because I felt I was intruding on a sort of private club. It was like a Masonic lodge or something. And I didn't think I would be very well received, which was true. But the interesting thing was that having got the camera in there, it began to play a sort of a booster role. This guy who was doing the Elvis show, he just started to fly. I mean, he just went to much higher levels than he had before, energized by the camera. On the other hand, the girl who was pouring the coffee, she didn't like the situation at all. I wasn't conscious of that. I was so concentrated on the performer. And in fact, as you found out, I lost access. I was kicked out. Now, it didn't matter much in the scheme of things then because it's only a tape that I would ever use in teaching, never to be broadcast. But imagine that you're deep into a project and that you lose access because you haven't been aware of what's happening. You haven't been alert to the tension in the situation. So what I was saying to my class was that access is so vitally important when you're making observational documentaries of this sort. We also call them cinema verite. Some people say that they're fly on the wall, but this tape showed that that's not true. You're virtually never a fly on the wall. You're drawn into the action in some way. You're influencing events, and you better know how you're doing that, because if you don't, you can find yourself on your ass outside after months and months in work. So that tape is a cautionary tale about access, gaining access, which I did in my sort of rather blundering way, but then keeping access, which I failed to do. I was fascinated by that question all through the 80s. That was made about 1984, I think. But I went seeking other documentary filmmakers to see what they thought about this. And I found they were so eager to talk about it because everybody worries about the same thing. Everybody realizes, whether they articulate it or not, that there's an exchange of valuables taking place. You're getting something, but what are the people in front of the camera getting? What are their expectations? Is it because they have a cause and they want to promote their cause through the filming? Have they got some chip at their shoulder? They feel they've always been misunderstood and they want to set things right? You have to understand. You have to work out what people want. Because if you know that, you're much less likely to get a nasty surprise. So I went off between classes talking to other filmmakers. And as I said, they were very happy to talk. The first person I met, I think, was Don Pennebaker, who made that great film Don't Look Back about Bob Dylan, also Monterey Pop, also The War Room about Bill Clinton's first campaign. Don was very thoughtful on this question. He told me that when he was starting out, thinking about being a documentary filmmaker, he lived in New York, and he would go along certain streets where there were lots of bars, and he would go from bar to bar, and in each bar he would take still photographs of people and see how they reacted, how he reacted to their reaction, got himself used to being this intrusive element and how that felt. I think the fact that Don was an extremely charming person with a twinkle in his eye probably mitigated hostility. Then he also told me that when he was making the film with Dylan, it was basically all set in a London hotel room. Dylan was there on tour, and he was this very prickly person, this very capricious person, and Don was very worried about how the access thing would work. So he told me, and I find it hard to believe, but he said that he spent the first 2 days in a corner of the hotel room, covered by a burnoose, which is some sort of thing, and he just sat there as a sort of lump, and everybody got used to the lump. Gradually he peeled this off, apparently, and then as time passed he started to put up his camera. He didn't look through the viewfinder. He kept eye contact with the scene all the time, and he would just from time to time push the button. I used that tape in my classes too, as I did one that I made with the Maisel brothers. David and Al Maisel had made a very famous film called Salesman, about Bible salesmen on the road, very touching film. And they'd recently made a film called Grey Gardens, about two very rich and eccentric Americans living, I think, on Long Island in a decayed mansion, mother and daughter, Big Edie and Little Edie. And the way the brothers related to these two women was that David Maisels, who did sound, said that Big Edie reminded him of his mother. They seem to have positioned themselves as children and also as coaches, because the Beale women had sort of very awkward relationships with tradesmen who would come to the decaying mansion, knocking on the door, wanting to offer some service. So the filmmakers became sort of in-betweens and coaches for the two women, and also collecting the hopes and dreams of Little Edie, who still dreamt of being a Broadway star. They kept their access, although things got very tricky at various points. But their empathy was such that they kept their access throughout. Empathy, I think, is amazing. If you're empathetic, it means you do have all your antenna up, you're thinking, you're putting yourself in the shoes of the other person, and you're alert to how they're feeling. And then there was Jeff Crines and Joel DeMott. I had met them at the Flaherty Seminar. Every autumn, upstate New York, there was this week-long documentary festival. You were invited to bring your documentary in and be hotly debated in front of a very intelligent crowd. I'd been invited twice, two of my films, and I think I met Jeff Crines and Joel DeMott there. Anyway, they had made a notorious film called Demon Lover Diary, which is not available. Can't tell you about it now, it's just too long a story to tell. But they'd also made 17. This was about teenagers in a town called Muncie, Indiana, a very conservative part of America. And they had got access to the lives of these teenagers, the intimate lives of these teenagers. And how do they do it? Well, Joel, who ran camera, said that they would always take the camera with them, and they would put it down wherever they were and just be there. And so there was never any thought that they would come without the camera. The camera was just part of them. And then, of course, they would pick it up and they would film, and the kids got absolutely used to this. And of course, today it wouldn't be a question because everybody's used to cameras, but that was not true at that time. So the kids got used to it, and Jeff and Joel got amazing material. In fact, it was material that was in a way too good, because over the year they spent with these teens, they got material about their interracial relationships. They got pot and other law-breaking things. They were so successful with their access that when it came to the point of the necessary screening for the school and the parents, the authorities put their foot down and the film was never broadcast. Again and again, as I present my own films, I'll talk about how I got access, how I kept access, how I nearly lost access in some occasions, all of that. But then, of course, there is the question, to what do you want to get access? How do you choose a topic? I talked about that at Harvard, of course, but it came up very dramatically when I was back in Australia in the late 90s, head of ABC Documentaries, bringing with me a show called Race Around the World. The idea of Race Around the World was that we would pick 8 young Australians who had never made films before. We'd give them the new little cameras that had just appeared on the market this big, and we would send them around the world, 10 countries, 10 days in each country, and they would make short films. We would broadcast them as they were still on the road. But of course they were also asking, well, what do we do? We're in a country, we've only got a very short time to find a subject. What are we looking for? And I came up with a checklist. And I think it was partially based on Robert Flaherty, who I mentioned before. Now, Flaherty was a mining engineer, not a filmmaker. He was a mining engineer who went up to the Canadian Arctic year after year at the time of the First World War, looking for minerals, and found the life of the Eskimos up there so fascinating that he decided to teach himself how to use a camera, and back he went to film the everyday life in the Arctic wastes. Well, he was convinced that his material was valuable enough to make a film and release. Came back to Toronto. In the editing room, he put it all together. But this foolish man had forgotten that nitrate film that he was working with was very inflammable. And he set everything on fire with his cigarette, dashed out into the snow, rolling in the snow, putting the flames out, saving his work print, but nothing else. All his rushes were gone. He later said that it was actually a blessing in disguise because he realized he was on the wrong track. And this brings me to my list, which may have been inspired by his discovery. And that was, he realized he had no central character. And there was one there. He'd been friends with this man he called Nanook the bear. In fact, the film he finally released was called Nanook of the North. So having a good character became one of the points on my list. I think I had it as number 3. Number 1 was, what is at stake? Well, there was lots at stake in the case of Nanook's story, because Nanook was far out in the Arctic wastes hunting with his little family. It was very, very dangerous. They could get stuck out there. They could die if a storm swept up. Anyway, there was lots at stake. The third point is story. Documentaries crave stories just as much as fiction films do. The thing is, the stories are not the same. In a fiction film, the story is written down, it's all set in stone there, and people are paid to act it out. In the documentary, you're looking for little story threads that are very ephemeral, very tenuous. And when you find a good thread, you have to nurture it. You have to wait for it to appear again and connect the dots, connect them together. It's very much a strange labor of love as you build up your story. And I think you'll probably, in my course, see it best when I show you all about Olive, my film on 104-year-old Olive Riley. So story threads are really, really important, and we talk a lot about how to nurture them in this course. The fourth thing is often forgotten with documentaries, but it's so important, and that is you must have material that touches the heart, not sentimental or saccharine, but if you have touching material, it's going to give a whole different dimension to your film. And so don't miss it. People ignore it. So touching is really important. And the fifth one is the big picture. What is it all about in a larger sense? Usually that is number 1, because when you're going for funding for a documentary, you pitch the big picture. You want to make a film about fracking. You want to make a film about inside Wall Street or whatever. You sell the big picture. Fine. But if you don't have all these other things going for you, then your big picture can be very barren. And that leads me to my second great of the past, who is John Grierson. Grierson was born in about 1898. He was a Scot, and he worked through the 30s in Britain. He was a big picture man. He said that art is a hammer. His idea was that he wanted to hammer away with his movies at themes that he thought were important. And his main obsession was that the British working man, this was the time of the Depression, by the way, that the British working man was always a figure of fun on the movie screens. And Grierson wanted to celebrate him as a heroic character. The film of his that I like best is called Nightmare. He didn't direct it, but it came from his stable. And it's about this strange train that dashes through the night from London to Edinburgh, no passengers on board, just men in cars sorting letters, putting them into pigeonholes, and when the pigeonhole is full and the letters are collected, they go into a pouch which is hung out at the side of the train, and wham, an arm whips it off the train so that without stopping the train goes on. There are no characters in it. These men are not celebrated, although there are little hits of humour. There's nothing actually at stake because this train goes every night, and there's nothing unpredictable about that. Story, I guess the train itself is the story, not the people, but the train itself is a big story and a big picture story all at the same time. It's a wonderful film. I owe Grierson a debt because he set up the National Film Board of Canada, where I worked for 30 years. He set it up at the time of the Second World War. It was a propaganda agency making films to counter Nazism, which they did very, very effectively. By the time I arrived at the film board in 1965, he was gone. I missed him. And when he came back several times on visits, I missed him too. But I do owe him something, and that is that by 1970 I'd made my first important film, which was called Sad Song of Yellow Skin, and this got into the Canadian Oscars. They were called Ertrogs, and John Grierson was on the committee the year they gave my film a gong. So I have to say thank you so much, John Grierson. So on to the course. The first film I talk about is called Persistent and Finagling. It was about a group of women, early feminists in Montreal, 1970, who have an environmental campaign. These are people under the radar. They're not celebrities, but there's something very touching about them. I love their courage, the way they keep on going in the face of difficulties. So I talk about that one, and then we go on through each one of my films, one class per film, canvassing all the issues that I've given you here today. So I hope you join me for the rest of the course. See you later.